Welcome to Brewers Hill, formerly Highland Town, home of the National Brewery and the Gunther Brewery. A lot of the old brewer workers live around here, and they stop by and tell us stories about what used to be in here. It's a lot of fun. The old war stories you hear are terrific. Oh, it was about 1 million barrels a year came out of the whole national complex. At one point, it was the 6th largest brewery in the country. All right, well, we're gonna head up to 9. National is a gravity-fed brewery, and the whole process started up on the 9th floor of the grain, ended up on the bottom floor of the beer. Almost there. Here we go. You coming up? Try to keep them on a timer, but every once in a while, you gotta give them a kick.
Been a part of the American experience for as long as the history of our country, and we have tied them to the local community and often to the local sports teams. When you look into the history of brewing in a city, you really are looking at the social history of the city, its habits, its cultures, its likes and its dislikes.
Baltimore is a complex city. It embraces its heritage. It embraces the waters of the Chesapeake Bay, whether it be blue crabs or oysters. This is Baltimore. It's complex by nature. You've got a divergent groups of people in one city sharing the city. Their different backgrounds, the different heritage, the different cultures that they come from, all working to preserve that, but also create what is Baltimore, which is combining all of these things in so many intriguing and wonderful ways. Baltimore was founded in 1729. It was actually kind of the merging of Baltimore town and Jonestown. It was a tiny little town, 61-acre lots with a stockade fence with only 3 gates to get in and out, just a little tiny town. And eventually it became this incredible port city, the 3rd largest port city in the nation. Baltimore, it's a unique place. It's a unique place, it's a wonderful place. But when you think of Baltimore, you're always gonna think of beer. You think Natty Boh, you think Gunther's most recently, and now you're starting to associate the newer craft brewers with Baltimore.
Loyalty was always been a big part of the Baltimore beer drinking experience.
Anything can happen. Life's a gamble every minute. Call it any name you want to. Life's a racket we're not onto. Don't try to figure it.
We tend to think, I tend to think, and I think other people do, things always sort of were this way, but they're not. And one of the things that Baltimore does very well is does old well. And when you look here, when you walk to these neighborhoods and you see these old buildings and these old houses, and you think, a guy might have made beer in his basement then and sold it out through that window that goes right onto the street. Or you look at this massive, massive size of this building and realize that at one point they made 1 million barrels of beer a year, which is astounding.
You can go from rag to riches. Anything can happen.
There's not a story that you'll hear from people that are native to Baltimore where one of their family members didn't work at National or Gunther. So there's always my uncle or my dad or my grandpa. So there really is that tradition. It was still part of Baltimore.
What I was impressed by, surprised me, was the deep German roots of this city. I knew that there's a strong German influence, but I didn't really realize how strong it was until I started looking at the breweries.
They were coming for a better quality of life. That's often a reason people emigrate. Some were escaping conflict within their own countries, civil war and imperialism from other countries. And some, I guess a majority, were coming for religious freedom. Religious toleration was big here in Maryland. So you had an opportunity to come establish yourself. Communities that were established in Baltimore, there was a strong sense of pride and belonging, not just where they came from and an understanding within the community of where they came from, but what they were building in Baltimore. And they were building a city. They were building a community where they could worship together, where their children would school together, where families and their workers would share their lives together. So everything that was happening in all facets. In the modern world, we separate often what we have in our home from our work life and then our social life. These were all intertwined. So everything was happening in the community on a social level, on an economic level, and on a political level, if you will. And all of this helped to build Baltimore, because if you strengthen the community and you're employing people in the community, they're spending money in the community. And this is, the standard economic cycle. And this is what is strengthening Baltimore.
I've been living like a dandelion. I've been staying up late drinking homemade wine, shaking my mane till the kids are crying, all right.
The vision of Union Craft Brewery, a true Baltimore neighborhood brewery, and to bring people together around the brewery, around our beers, to introduce people to craft beer and to challenge people's palates who already know about craft beer. We want to have one foot in the past and one foot in the future. I think that's what craft beer is all about, is paying homage to the past while being progressive and moving forward. We're situated right here in Woodbury. It's a historic mill community. It's an old industrial area, and we wanted to, we're very location specific, so we wanted to pay homage to, what's come before us right here in this place. So, we chose the cog as a symbol of that work.
We like just the feel of the name of Union. We're on Union. We're representing Union Avenue. We've united to kind of make this product together. So it was just a riff off of Union and uniting and stuff like that. When people come for a tour, we want you to get an authentic sense that it's me and John in here. We're sweating, not in your beer, but we're sweating. And we're working hard to make this authentic product. We're not a big mega brewery that's got guys pushing buttons on computers, and we're here working with our hands, we're killing our backs, and we want you to get a sense that we're so committed to this product, and that we want you to have this quality beer.
About 2.5 years ago, I attend an event at the first Baltimore Beer Week. I'm there with a friend, and I decide to say, hey, I've been working on this plan to open a brewery. What do you think? And the first thing that came to his mind was, I had a friend in college, we were in the dorms together, who went on to become a craft brewer, a very successful craft brewer. He is looking to make a change in his life too. He lives in Chicago, why don't I connect you two? Next day I gave him a call and we went from there.
I heard you around and I really just wanted to know.
ton of hurdles, just from fundraising to getting all this equipment in here, getting everything approved, starting everything up, finding a distributor to get our beer out to the public. It's been a ton of stuff, you know, so it's good to finally be on this journey now.
You find something that you really want to do, get the ball rolling to a point that you can't really stop it, because your instinct as an entrepreneur is to bail out. I mean, there's just, the odds are stacked against you. It's really a daunting task. But eventually you reach a point where you just can't really look back, and that's where you got to push it. There's such a great energy here, great creative spirit. It's a little offbeat, it's a little quirky. That's kind of how I am as a person. That fits right in with how I wanted Brewery to be. And there's a great beer scene here, and we felt like this is a perfect place for us. If we can be in Baltimore City and really be authentic to Baltimore and true to Baltimore, we felt like this is really going to work, and that Baltimore needs this.
We want to partner with this city. We want our money to be in this city. We want this city to give us, we want to keep that flow going that keeps the economy going. You know, a lot of people look at Baltimore as a somewhat depressed city in many ways, but I think there's a vibrant, there's a thriving youth culture here that can make the city into something even greater than it is now. And I think that by supporting a business like us or supporting any other businesses in the area, that you're helping to make Baltimore a greater city.
You know, from the 1830s to 1863, the city's population surged from about 80,000 to 225,000. And with that, an immense increase in the number of breweries, I think from 4 to 30 or about that.
When we look at these breweries, many that initially came over as employees that were housed and taken care of as an employee of the brewery will venture off and begin their own tavern or their own brewery. So they learn the trade as it operates in Baltimore, and then they set out and establish their own breweries. These are recipes that they've had in their families for generations, and that's what they're bringing with them when they come to Baltimore and they're establishing their breweries. So we see this incredible growth in the late 19th century because you've got these immigrants, you've got their homebrew recipes that they brought with them or recipes they've learned from the breweries that they worked at, establishing now their own breweries and just building in the community, giving back to the community that took them in. It's really, it's an amazing time in the history of Baltimore for its growth, but also for expanding that sense of community throughout the city. Some of the major breweries that we see during the 19th century globe: Wiesner's, George Bauernschmidt, John Bauernschmidt, George Brehm, August Beck, Frank Stiles, Fred Bauernschmidt. You've got quite a few family members in business. John Wiesner emigrated from Bavaria to Baltimore, and in 1860 he worked for another brewer in Baltimore for a few years. In 1863 he opened Wiesner's Brewery. Initially it was small, but pretty quickly he was doing so well with his brewing business that he built a grand structure on North Gay Street. And in addition to all of this, Wiesner was embracing new technology. So these kinds of things really brought his brewery to be one of the greatest in the city.
So the brewing process begins here. This is at the top of a roughly 10,000 bushel grain elevator. Grain would come in and be brought all the way up here, which is roughly 150 feet above the street level. This diverter would then divert the grain, depending upon whether it was hops, barley, malt, what have you, down into the grain elevator, and then from there it would flow through the entire brewing process. Their peak production in 1919 was 110,000 barrels of beer a year. When Prohibition was enacted, Wiesner Brewery went out of business, And at that point, it was taken over by the American Malt Company. During Prohibition, they made malt syrup here, and once Prohibition was repealed, they were ready to go and begin brewing American beer. They employed roughly about 300 people at their peak, with nearly 300,000 barrels of beer being produced in their peak year, which would have been in the late 50s, early 60s. The leadership of Humanum had the pleasure of discovering the American brewery back in 2005. And at that time, it had been derelict for nearly 40 years, probably within a year of a complete structural collapse.
There's frost on the moon and snow on the ground, but with you around, there's spring in my heart.
What excited us about the building was its potential, both symbolically but also in terms of what we could do here. We're focused on helping people to work and to get family-supporting jobs. So we wanted to, in that sense, celebrate the work that prior workers had done in this building. And the best way to do that is to keep all of these historic elements of the brewing process to show history of what went on here. We wanted people to be able to come through this building and see why it isn't just any old building that could have been built today. Looking around, it becomes really obvious that what makes this building unique is there's so many diverse elements. You'll see there are 3 cupolas on the building. No 2 of those are the same. Each one is unique. The type of architecture that you're seeing is actually referred to as German chalet. Other times it's referred to as circus architecture. But also what's really interesting is the place of the building, both within this immediate community, but also in Baltimore City. When 1887, there would have been none of the houses here. A lot of this would have been open fields, open space. People would actually come up in their horse and carriage up Gay Street from downtown. Many of the workers actually were housed in a building across the street, the same residence where the brewmaster lived. So people would actually be coming out, if you will, to make a day of it, to come here, both get their beer, but also sort of enjoy fellowship with the other German immigrants that they may have known from the area. And it was only after the turn of the century in 1900 that this area became annexed into Baltimore City proper. This is one of the most interesting spaces, I think, in the building. It's certainly one of the most dramatic. We're actually standing in the center of the 10,000 bushel grain elevator. All of this originally was completely enclosed, so the openings you see were obviously didn't exist. All of the grain came and was kept within this space. Each of these was individual 2x6s that were nailed together, and part of the reason for doing it was the strength. The excitement for me is you can come up here and you can look, and even after all this time since the brewery closed in 1973, there are still individual grains visible in between each of these boards. In 1973, ironically, the same year that this brewery went out of business, the building itself was added to the Federal National Register of Historic Places. What that does do, it prevents the building from being demolished, but it doesn't preserve or protect the building and revive it in any particular way. Really able to do that, you need innovative individuals who are willing to dedicate time, talent, and let's be honest, financial resources necessary to be able to turn what had been a derelict site into what you see today, a thriving building. There are a number of other sites, not just brewery sites, other industrial sites that are no longer with us today because there weren't individuals who had the foresight to preserve spaces like this. Certainly, it's more of a challenge to be able to rebuild sites like this, but the rewards are great. One of the key goals that Humanum had when we were looking for a site for our Baltimore operations was to identify a building that could serve as a hub within the community that it was based. And thankfully for us, we were able to find and identify the American Brewery building. Obviously, it was an important hub in its heyday as a brewing hub and brewing center. We want to take it and revitalize it as we've been able to do and do some unique things here. Have it as a site that once again can serve as an anchor for the community here in Broadway East, and we will do everything within our power to continue helping folks in this community and in communities throughout Baltimore to get those skills necessary to be able to be gainfully employed and be happy, productive members of the city of Baltimore.
though you made us sad for many, many long and weary years. With your war against the rum, we all got on the bum, but we're thankful that you gave us back the beer. What are we gonna do with that old homebrew? We do not need it since we have the beer.
So basically just referencing my notes from the last time I made this recipe. And it's kind of critical, or very helpful, I should say, to keep notes as you go along, especially if you want to recreate, rather than having to do all the calculations again.
America, you see, prohibition could not be. You made your law against the rock and rye.
So what we have here is 26 pounds of German Pilsner malt. It's already been milled, so the grain is cracked open more or less to expose the sugars. Except for the guy tarring his roof across the street, it smells great. And it starts with steeping your grains in hot water, much like you would steep tea. Let it sit for roughly an hour. As the sugars in the grain are converted to a fermentable sugar. After that, you rinse the grains and the solids with hot water, trying to extract as much of the sweet liquid from the solids as you can. You collect all that in your pot, boil it for roughly an hour with the addition of hops. All right, here they go. We have 10 minutes left to go in the boil. So this is the second to last hops addition. Just more pellet hops going in, more of the Sriracha Ace going in here. About a ½ ounce of each for this addition. And cool it and add the yeast, and that's the process kind of in a nutshell. Being a lager, it'll ferment at about 50 degrees for about 2 to 3 weeks. Then I'll turn it down to around 40 for another week or two before I keg it, and then from there, just add CO2 and it's ready to go. You would think people would be more prone to being overly protective of the way they make something, is to avoid somebody from stealing their ideas and their practices, but it's really been the complete opposite. So it's a lot of shared knowledge. I mean, that's one of the really exciting things about the home brewing world, is how willing people are to share their ideas and inventions, even just tricks of the trade. And the recipes in particular, I mean, you'll see pretty well-established brewmasters, people who've designed some really successful recipes, then go and really break down exactly how they're doing it for home brewers, give them the exact hop bill and things like that. So it's about 1/8 of a cup of pink Himalayan sea salt. It's really colorful stuff. A lot of great mineral character to it. Used it before. I've only made one other salted beer, and it was right on that threshold of being a little too heavily salted, but part of it I thought came out really nicely, so giving it another shot here. Making beer in the backyard is one thing where I know I can oversee who consumes it and how quickly it's consumed to make sure that it's fresh. I mean, I'll taste it, quite frequently after it's finished, but, for a beer maker, once it leaves their hands, it's hard to really oversee how it's being handled, how it's being stored, how long it's being stored, and what its shelf life is really going to be.
We do not need it since we have the beer. We do not want the brew, although we know it's true. When days were dark, it was to us so dear.
In the 19th century, we start to see distribution increase. It's not going to go much beyond the region as far as Maryland, Delaware, Virginia. You'll start to see it filter more into the south and more to the west after the technology of what is called the crown cork seal. That is actually invented by William Painter in 1891.
Basically, a brewer could only make as much beer as he could deliver in the neighborhood. And now, when you sealed the beer, You could store it or you could ship it a great distance. And so that opened up the markets. Beer drinkers all around America should thank Baltimore. Crown, cork, and seal figured out how to put a cap on a beer bottle and keep the insides in good shape.
And that's really what the Industrial Revolution gave us, is an ability to be more efficient. We didn't have to dig out the lagering cellars because we had refrigeration machines. So we could keep our beer cool and allow it to age if we were making the lagers. If we were making ales and other style beers, we cool down the product and get it to market as soon as it was ready. So these sorts of innovations were critical, but the other piece that I think never should be overlooked is that you have the technology. It can allow you to do the things that you already do much better, but it also allows you to get creative. And some of the brewers that you'll see in Baltimore will change their methods, steam power, to heat the mash instead of using a copper kettle over open fire. So these sorts of things, changing the way that they operate and getting creative with how they're producing their beer as opposed to just creating the same thing at a faster, more efficient pace.
Brewers did have a good feel for the science of brewing. Now, they may not have had the terminology, they may not have had the microscopes. I suspect without thermometers, they would basically use their senses. But these people had been brewing beer for years, especially the Germans, and they had been told how to do it by their father or their brewmaster, who were pretty strict people.
It's funny, a lot of brewing texts from the early 1900s are still have some relevance today. You know, so while things have changed and technology and refrigeration technology has gotten a lot better, a lot of stuff still stays the same. We're still using malted barley, they're still using hops, they're still using yeast, so that hasn't changed at all. So Balt is a German-style alt beer. It's a style that originated in Dusseldorf, Germany.
It's an old world, old school style, and Baltimore has a rich German brewing tradition. That's why we chose to make that beer and to call it Balt.
You know, it's a historical style, and alt beers are a historical style, so I wanted to stick close to that tradition, but put our own spin on it. You know, so our alt beer might be a little bit hoppier than, say, a traditional German alt beer, but it's going to still follow a very similar malt bill. So we'll do a single decoction on it, and that's an old world thing. That's what the Germans used to do before there was thermometers. They knew that they boiled it and added it to another batch of the beer. They were raising the temperature on it. So we're going to have to do some old world techniques while we're brewing this new school beer.
Brewing is kind of like alchemy. I mean, you're taking grains and turning them into fermentable sugars. I mean, we have a lot more data, experience, control over the brewing environment and the brewing process. I think if anything, what we've learned is that while we may have more control over our environment, things are still very much as they are.
Innovation in terms of how do we make the products better, how do we make the products more efficiently, how do we control costs, how do we measure market, all of that's very important. When we got started, we only had 4 tanks, and we had that's an original one. That one. We started Clipper City well, for all intents and purposes, we started brewing beer in December of 1995. I had been at Sisson's, which was the first brew pub in the state of Maryland, from May of 1980 until December of 1994. The last 5 years is when we became a brew pub. That was a completely unheard of concept at that time. That sort of went hand in hand with the excitement that was being generated in downtown.
But where you're standing right now is actually the brew house. You say you're not from Maryland, though, are you? Yeah.
There weren't a whole lot of competitors out there. I think there were probably under 5 brew pubs in the United States at the time.
In Arizona, you have a brew pub in Arizona? Any of the breweries? I thought
The bar hadn't been set very high, so I was very fortunate that I was existing in what at the time was a fairly forgiving world.
With 3 fermenters, we're trying to serve up to 5 beers. So right away we have a real potential problem in trying to keep up with the demand on 5 beers with only 3 fermenting tanks.
We were making 210 gallons at a clip, and the product never left our control, to moving to the Clipper City platform where we were making 3,000 gallons at a clip, and virtually every drop of the product was going to leave our control and go into a distribution network, was an enormously steeper challenge than I had foreseen. So while the market was on a big rise, the business base that existed wasn't that big. I had unrealistic perspective of the demand for craft beer because I had come out of an environment where all the customers that I had were there because of the beer. And I suffered from thinking that that was representative of the entire world. We discovered that, yeah, the demand wasn't nearly as strong as we had thought and hoped it would be.
You know, at 200 gallons, there's stuff that you can do by hand that you can't do on this level. Secondly, think about it. We were starting a company from ground zero. We were making, I think initially 3 or 4 different beers, recipes that we had never brewed before, on equipment that we had never used before, going into packaging equipment that none of us ever run before, going into a distribution network that nobody knew the ins and outs of. So I'm actually pretty damn proud of the fact that we survived it. It was pretty brutal.
We survived because after the first year or so of business, we started contract brewing, where we were actually making beer for a lot of other people. At its height, 75% of the beer that we were shipping on an annualized basis was labels for other people. I'm very happy to say that that is no longer the case. In 2010, we rebranded from sort of a mishmash of brands. I mean, the company's called Clipper City. We had a Clipper City brand, an Oxford brand, and our Heavy Seas brand, which is our line of bigger beers. And we decided to just sort of streamline, focus everything under the Heavy Seas brand. We put all of our eggs in one basket and rolled the dice, and it was the height of the recession. And I really thought that, you know, we would be really lucky if we grew a little tiny bit, and we grew 35% that year. So it clearly was the right move. I wish the hell I'd done it like 2 years earlier. So, first off, it's a business. You have to realize it's a business. You have to have the passion behind the business, because this is a hard business. But if you don't understand the numbers, and if you don't understand the potential for market share, and what you're going to have to do to get it, it can be challenging.
By the late 19th century, we have over 40 breweries within the city limits of Baltimore. Many of them are owned and or operated by the immigrants that have come into Baltimore. Not everybody's going to be producing their own malt, so they'll buy it from a malt house, or what we would call a maltster. And what would happen if your brewery was struggling, you always needed the malt or you couldn't make the beer. So you often were indebted to your maltsters.
There were probably too many breweries in Baltimore. Now, it's hard to imagine a city that has too many breweries, but in fact, breweries were competing with each other and losing money. And so they hit upon this idea to form trusts in the Maryland Brewing Company.
And they buy 17 breweries in Baltimore. Many of them were the top breweries, like the Bauernschmidt Brewery. George Bauernschmidt Brewery was incredible. The production was outstanding. They were not in debt to the maltsters. It was one of the most advanced breweries of the time. They sold to the Maryland Brewing Company.
And the idea was all for one and one for all. and you weren't supposed to, so-and-so would make this beer, so-and-so would make that beer. But brewers are an independent lot, and they didn't take to it. They didn't play by the rules. So in 2 years, that trust dissolved.
Then Gottlieb, Baron-Schmidt, and Strauss. Strauss is one of the biggest malt houses in Baltimore. They combine with Gottlieb and Baron-Schmidt. Baron-Schmidt, obviously, from the Baron-Schmidt family. And they buy up only a handful of the top breweries that had been under Maryland Brewing Company. Much more successful, because obviously if you have one of the biggest malt houses in Baltimore as part of the monopoly, you have access to the malt for the breweries. It's going to be more efficient and it's going to bring the costs down. And looking at the rise of the monopolies at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, there was a fear that we were going to lose our independent brewers and the recipes that we had come to love over the past several decades. So you'll see Frank Stiles Independent Brewery. You'll see Fred Baron-Schmidt, the son of George, who literally established his own brewery to compete with the monopoly that bought his father's brewery because he was so infuriated that his father had sold out. And that attitude is pervasive throughout Baltimore. So going and buying your beer from a brewer that says they are independent and they are free of a monopoly is something that Baltimoreans were happy to embrace and say, okay, here we go, we're going for the independent brewery.
Unlike today, where you have these massive breweries, there was no Milwaukee or Brussels telling them how to make beer. They still made it their own way. And that, I think, is probably what led to the dissolution, because they were not all for one and one for all. They were still doing things their way.
In the beginning of my beer career, there was definitely a sense of David versus Goliath, and I think that was in many respects exacerbated by the Bush family back in the when they were controlling Anheuser-Busch before it became AB InBev. They actually did some fairly overt things that sort of underscored the point that it was them versus us. Truthfully, I don't know that they were that concerned about us because we were just such a small piece of the overall thing that they were overlooking us anyway. But there was definitely a sense of David versus Goliath. These days, I don't see it as much that way anymore.
No, I don't even bother worrying about that. There's a lot of people in the craft beer scene that feel like it's this battle against the big breweries, the mass-produced macro brews, and craft beer. But I think that argument is getting tired. I think craft beer is almost its own separate segment in the marketplace.
We, at the end of 2011, as a category, just broke 5%. Now, people may say that's a small number. No, that's a gymongous number. 5% of the national beer market is a big number. That makes it about an $11 or $12 billion a year business.
It's interesting to see that, for example, big distributors that are used to handling the big guys are now picking up craft beer portfolios because they know that's the future of the industry for them. I think it's good to have a brew pub because the money you're spending on beer here or in the grocery store goes back to people here. Everybody who works here lives here and spends money here. It all flows forward. It all goes to other merchants. You're keeping it local, literally. I remember my first brew pub experience in Santa Cruz, California, when I was an undergraduate. While we were accustomed to craft beer in the form of beers like Anchor Steam, this pub on Front Street was the first place where you could walk in and see the tanks and say, wow, this beer's made right here. Just the idea that you were having it feet away from where you saw a guy crawling out of a tank was pretty incredible. Well, the story behind the Brewer's Art is that I was sitting with a couple of friends in the old Rendezvous Lounge, and we had this lemonade stand idea. We're home brewers, and we thought, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we somehow got it together and actually opened our own brew pub? I had a little bit of business experience running a record label, and that wasn't nearly enough to run a restaurant or a brewery, for that matter. But somehow we learned as we went, and we're still here. This is a kind of a curious building. It was built around the turn of the last century. It's the first fireproof building south of New York. It was built in 1905, right after the Great Fire that leveled a good chunk of downtown Baltimore. And the investment banker that opened the building wanted to have a fireproof building. So it's all concrete and steel, which is an architectural curiosity, but also made it a little bit challenging. Our brew house, getting it in here, we had to take these giant windows out of the front of the building. By the time the rigging crew got the brew house into this dining room, we realized there's no way we're getting it to where it needs to go without taking out a lot of this architectural detail, and that was just not gonna happen. So they had to send down a welder from Canada, took all the welds apart, and then reassembled it inside the actual brewing space there. That was a handful, but we finally got it in, and now that it's in there, it's not going anywhere. We're here for the long haul. Well, when we started in '96, we were one of the first breweries in the country that really focused on sort of the anarchic beers of Belgium and France. I hesitate to say that we're a Belgian-style brewery, although we tend to get pigeonholed into that category, because really we're an American brewery. A lot of folks ask, where do you actually make your beer? And I tell them everything's right on Charles Street, and they don't understand that there's this huge area of fermentation and conditioning tanks way down in the basement. The big tanks we use for our flagship beer, Resurrection, which still accounts for probably a little over half of our production. And then we make probably 20 to 25 different beers throughout the year. Actually, it might even be up to 30 at this point. Well, the influences really come from all over. I mean, they come from, certainly from pre-Prohibition beer styles, but also from beer styles that are more recent as well. We'd like to do a combination of tradition and innovation. At the Brewers, I believe in measured growth. We've been around for 16 years, and we've grown slowly, but we have grown. It's not uncommon for us to get calls from people that really want to pour our beer in their pub, but we just can't do it. We're in a limited space, we're in a historic building, but as a result, we can kind of take things at our speed and maintain the quality control for our products that we take very seriously.
When we look at 1920, we see the incorporation of Prohibition, which means no alcohol unless you have a prescription. Which if, you had a stomach ache or apparently a knee ache or a headache or any ache at all, alcohol could cure it. And if you could get your doctor to prescribe it, then you were free to drink. So it was considered the dry years.
Maryland didn't like Prohibition and never passed legislation that enabled any policeman to enforce prohibitions. The only enforcement was from the feds, outsiders. And so Maryland that's how it's known as the free state. And Maryland also didn't really abide by Prohibition. There was plenty of ways around it. They employed several tactics. Malt was allowed to be made, and actually, it's for medicinal purposes only, of course, and also there was a little recipe that was passed out. If you use malt and a certain amount of hops and a certain amount of this in your bathtub, you might end up with something like beer. Some of them made buzzless beers that had less than 0.5%. And so they were bad beers. There's no doubt about it. Nobody liked them. But when Prohibition ended, they were quickly come back into production.
But in total, when you look at the 13 years that Prohibition existed in the United States, $300 million in state and federal revenues were lost. So it wasn't just the breweries or the distilleries, it wasn't just the alcohol industries, it was all of the associated industries that help make the products for the alcohol, that help make the signs. Large-scale job loss because of Prohibition. And when we look at Baltimore, We did everything we could, not only to fight against it, but to keep making alcohol in Baltimore even during Prohibition.
I work in a very visual and linear fashion. I see like different elements of the beer, be it the aroma, the malt, sweetness, the hop bitterness, the esters of the yeast. It's like everything is almost like comes in a color code. It's like an artist going about making a painting or a sculpture. It's like, you know, if something in life inspires me to create and to encapsulate either that moment or that feeling, emotion, or just whatever. I mean, it's like whatever inspires any artist to create their product. Gypsy Brewer, it's kind of what it's a couple of us out there in the world that we've been tagged. It's kind of like a facet of contract brewing, if you want to dumb it down to that level, but definitely done in a more hands-on way. I think probably the best term for myself, which I would prefer other than Gypsy Brewer, would be like a beer designer. I've come at the beer world with a very different focus and different vision on like how I wanted to do things. This is Existent. I don't know, I call it the kind of like the defining beer of Stillwater, because it's the existential beer. At first glance, you know, it's a dark beer. You're like, oh, is that a stout or a porter? But it's actually extremely dry in its body. It's a beer that kind of throws off your whole judgment, looking, smelling, and then tasting. I got into the early days of the electronic music scene, so I was making techno and house music. Now, I built a fairly prominent career in music, but it wasn't completely satisfying to myself, and I was losing my passion for it, so I figured it was best for me to kind of end it on a high note. I started hanging out at the Brewer's Art with some of my friends. We'd go there for happy hour all the time, and Belgian beer was a real eye-opener. I was kind of lost, you know, it's like I was an artist without an outlet then, so I had a lot of pent-up creativity that I didn't know what to do with. I'm just an obsessive kind of person. I got really into, into beer, and I had a friend that had one of those homebrew kits. I asked if I could borrow it. And I was like, I'd like to try my hand at making a beer. It sounds kind of fun. I didn't save any money by making the beer myself. In fact, it was probably the most expensive beer I ever had because of the amount of time that went into it. So if I'm going to be doing this, I need to do something unique. I need to make a beer that doesn't exist. So I kind of like took all that knowledge from the business side of music and kind of related it over to the beer world. I had a very definitive idea of how I wanted to approach the construction of my beers, but I also didn't have a lot of the preconceived notions. Like if I worked in a brewery and I worked my way up to brewmaster, it's like years of repetition and doing creating maybe recipes for other people or recipes that you have to make because you're trying to fulfill a void in the market or a place in the market. I didn't have that those kind of restrictions, like in my mind, it's like I was like, I'm gonna make this, unique product, and I'm gonna put it out there and just see what happens. And if it failed, I didn't have some massive debt that was going to basically crush my life afterwards. Maybe I cranked out about a dozen different beers in the first year. One of the big things in craft brewing is these beers are brewed with all barley. Mass-produced beers are corn and rice. I always thought that was a very shallow argument. So I went out to kind of debunk that. So I took all the same ingredients that would be used, down from the type of hops to the amount of corn and rice used, and rebuilt it into a superior product. And that would stand in the world of craft beer, but it's just reminiscent of any post-prohibition, like mass-produced light American lager. It's not necessarily the ingredients that you do use, but it's kind of how you approach the construction.
After World War II, there was a change in the taste, what we were looking for in beer. That came from a couple of things. One is that we had finally created a can, American Can Company in Baltimore, created a can that you could put beer in and ship long distances and retain the quality. Once we started doing this, a certain percentage of the beer that we were producing in Baltimore was allocated for our soldiers and sailors that were fighting overseas during World War II. By the time the beer arrived, even though the can was a success, you still get a loss of flavor and a loss of taste, and it seems a little more watered down.
The taste for beer from the GIs came back from the war was for a lighter lager. And that is what a lot of the American breweries, including the breweries in Baltimore, including this one right here in National Bow, that's what appealed to. And so what you see now is a rebirth of brewing. And in Baltimore, this is very evident because you have National Brewing Company, you have the Gunther Brewing Company, we have American Brewery, we have Globe, and then we have the new one, Free State, come up. So all of a sudden, there are all these breweries competing for this new and thirsty beer market.
And that coincides with the rise of the big five breweries in the nation. And we start to see they're selling the preferred taste, but also they're selling a little bit cheaper than what the local breweries are producing. So we start to see them overshadow our local breweries that had worked so hard to rebuild after Prohibition.
You had a number of companies who were, for the first time, becoming national brands, such as Anheuser-Busch and Miller and Schaefer and Schlitz, et cetera, who then very strategically came through and sort of killed the local brewery and then took over the market. So that was sort of the great homogenization of beer.
By the time we reach the early 70s, Free State is gone, Globe is gone, and American has sold their recipe and is now no longer operating by 1973. That leaves us with what was once Gunther's. They had sold out to Theo Ham, a major brewer from Minneapolis, and National. And when we look at National is the one that is able to compete on a larger scale because they've already opened plants in the Midwest to accommodate the demand for their beer.
Oh, the National Brewery was an amazing operation. You know, it made up to about 1 million barrels a year.
You had people, regardless of what tier you were at National, whether you're an executive or a janitor, would all come together and share a drink at the end of the day. So this was something that kept that sense of we're all equal here, we're all part of the same community.
In the 60s, what happened after this period of growth competition started coming in from outside the region, other big breweries from St. Louis and Milwaukee. And the reasons for this, one is the interstate highway system. You could can a beer in Milwaukee and ship it to Baltimore easily. And there was this thing called television. And television meant national advertising. They basically faced the issue of how you compete against these brewing companies. National seems to have done the best job of those breweries and going about it. And they had several very clever campaigns. One was the Land of Pleasant Living. Hamm's had bought Gunther in 1959 and brought in a Dancing Bear beer from the land of sky blue waters. And so National saw this, said, we can do better than that. Went out to Hollywood, got some of the same people who created the Hamm's beer to work on the Land of Pleasant Living ad campaigns. And people in Baltimore can still sing those jingles because they combine local history with a plug for national beer.
It's the National Troubadour!
It's a thrilling sight to all the people here on the shores of the Chesapeake Bay. Happy occasions call for quality national beer. Quality.
And so a lot of it is marketing, how you sell the product, how you identify, get your core group of drinkers to identify with your beer. In 1975, National merged with Carling and shortly thereafter moved from this plant here in East Baltimore down to what's called the Beltway plant.
And that's going to stay for another almost 15 years, but that'll be really the last major brewery that we have in Baltimore.
There were over 2,000 establishments in Baltimore that sold beer, and at one point in time, every one of them sold national beer.
Well, it was interesting because as you see the big five, if you will, winning out and taking over all the smaller breweries in the competition, you also start to see a change. In 1978, Jimmy Carter passed legislation to make it legal once again to brew beer in your own home, which it had been illegal since Prohibition. And once he did this, the floodgates kind of opened because people started to brew their own beer once again. I mean, this is something that was part of our tradition, our heritage, our identity, and we lost it, but it was coming back.
Baltimore brewing now it's burgeoning, it's blossoming. There are many, many craft brewers that have come onto the scene since Hugh Sisson started in '89, and then so we see, Flying Dog came in out of Colorado, Brewer's Heart opened, we have the Pratt Street Ale House, we have Peabody Heights, which just opened, we have Union Craft Brewing. So I think it's a bright future. These people obviously know how to make good beer, and there are a lot of people out there who are interested in that.
It's truly an American kind of revolution, The Germans perfected beer, a lot of people say, but I think that the Americans blew the door off of it and revolutionized it and made these big, bold, flavorful beers that now the rest of the world is trying to emulate. So it's really cool to be part of this kind of movement of some guys, 30, 40 years ago that were dissatisfied with the selection of beer that they had. And so from Fritz Maytag at Anchor and Ken Grossman at Sierra Nevada, Hugh Sisson here in Maryland, they all came together and started making their own beers. And it's cool to be a part of that and to be a part of changing the dynamic of what's out there.
One of the things that was so intimidating and exciting about those early days brewing beer at Sisson's, and as we were developing that whole project, is you have to understand, at that point in time, there really wasn't a template to follow. We didn't know. I did go out to UC Davis and do a little bit of work trying to understand the principles of brewing science a little bit more, but for the most part, I woke up one morning, I owned $350,000 worth of stainless steel and a book, and that's how we learned how to brew beer. Now, having said that, that was really fun.
I think my generation is one of the first generations that was exposed to craft beer as something very normal and not something unusual and, oh, isn't that neat, they make their own beer. It's become very commonplace throughout the country now. And I think people are much more accepting of the fact that craft beer means quality beer, and they're willing to pay a little bit more for a quality-made product.
There's a good quote from Vonnegut that it's something along the lines of, man's knowledge of himself has not kept pace with his knowledge of the physical world. So it's like we can go about, manipulating things around us, but at the same time, it's, maybe it's a bit too philosophical for the idea of beer creation, but I mean, this is kind of why I do what I do. It's like, and I like the idea of creating beer because it's something that's been around. It hasn't really changed in like 10,000 years that much.
National Brewery and what was Gunther's, then Theo Ham's, actually were renovated. There's new companies that have gone in and are housed, their offices are housed within the buildings. But what they've done is honored the brewing tradition. So when you go to what is now called Brewers Hill, where you have the national complex with the Gunther's complex, they're all brand new office buildings, but you see Natty Boh. You see Natty Boh signs, you see Stag signs, you see the tradition of brewing in that location for so many years, for over 200 years, honored by the architects, by the people. Natty Boh, they put up a sign, Natty Boh, you can see it from many points in the city, including 95, where he is winking at you as soon as the sun goes down, keeping watch over the beer lovers of Baltimore. One of the most important reasons that we study history is our identity. What made Baltimore into what she is today. If you restore that, you're also understanding, you're reaching out to a piece of your past, not just this beautiful building, but Baltimore's foundations and how she got to be where she is today. Without that understanding, we lose who we are in Baltimore. We need to track who we are in Baltimore, and this is an integral piece. So it's much more than just a structure. It's what made Baltimore great.
Pleasant living.